Bringing the biography to life in Edmonton Public Schools. So what have we done? Now, I mean, I want to make it really clear that we've just started implementation in Edmonton Public. We're not at all like countries like Ireland, for example, where this is well established and has taken root and has been happening for a long time. We're really trying to figure this out. What we've noticed so far is that the biography seems to be the favored starting point of teachers. We have adapted materials that are available from Council of Europe documents. We have not tried to reinvent the wheel. We just want to use and adapt whatever is out there. And as I said, the milestone document was the first one. And actually what we did, if you want to know the specifics of it, is we just made copies of, there was 3 or 4 documents that we were working with, these just sort of publicly available documents. And we gave one to every consultant, and we just sat down at a table and had one of them that was a master copy and said, okay, let's think about the grades 4 to 6 student. Which one of these would work? And if so, does it work as is, or do we need to make any changes to it? And then we just went through page by page by page. And some of the documents, pretty much the whole thing, because it was, you know, intended for, let's say, high school students in Virginia, nothing really worked. And in some other documents, there was lots that worked, but needed adaptation. And so that's what we did, and created one master copy. And from that came the first draft. And then we sort of ironed out some kinks on that one, and from that one came the second draft, and that's sort of what we're working with now. We've created a few materials. The creation of the materials seems to just come on so far just on an ad hoc basis. When we needed something specific to meet the needs of a teacher who wanted to implement in a specific way. Some of the materials that were created for the K-3 bank, because it's very small, were ones that I created for implementing portfolio with my own daughter. And she was 4 when I started, and she's 5 years old now. And so I created some very, very basic kind of biography worksheet pages for her, and thought, well, I'll add those in. Recording feedback for Futures Teacher's Guide, as I've said. And, you know, this is the construct we're working with right now. I don't know if it's the best way to do it, but sometimes you just have to choose something and go. So we have K-3 materials 4 to 6, 7 to 9, and 10 to 12. It may not stay that way, of course, then people say, well, what about, you know, French immersion, and what about bilingual, and what about language and culture? We haven't got there yet. We're looking at it from the aspect of age appropriate at this time. So, advantages that we've noticed so far. It seems that the materials are pedagogically familiar to teachers. It looks like, and I don't know if you noticed from working through some of these biography pages, that it looks like something familiar, something you would have encountered in a classroom before. You know, there's filling in blanks, and there might be drawing a picture, and there's filling in some basic and simple information. And some of these sheets, like especially the little introduction one where you draw a picture of yourself and gives a little bit of basic information, are the kinds of things that teachers would ask kids to do on the first day of school, to put in their book. It's been pretty easy to implement. Some teachers like to go forward with a plan. You know, this is my long-range plan for implementation, but most of them just want to try it out. Just to get, you know, some people are tentative about trying something new and wondering, is this going to be a lot of work, and how much do I really want to commit to? So we just say, okay, just, you know, try it out. And they're finding that it's been pretty easy to implement so far. The materials have been easy to adapt from our perspective. When we take things like the milestone document, it's pretty clear to us when we sit down with it what adjustments we need to make. Like we made the one about including cultural similarities, changing country to place. Sometimes the adaptations have just been formatting, because, you know, a lot of the documents might be at a level that's appropriate for young children, but they're formatted maybe for adults. So we've maybe changed fonts and formatting. It's aligning with assessment practices and beliefs, which I'll come to a slide later to illustrate that more. And it reflects curricular expectations. What teachers are seeing on these biography pages that we have so far are, for lack of a better term, singing the same tune as what they have in their curriculum, because in the curricula there are outcomes about appreciating other cultures, and there are outcomes about understanding cultural similarities and differences and their impact. There are outcomes about metacognition and thinking about yourself as a language learner and your self-concept as a language learner. Pedagogically familiar. Okay, so here's a biography page. This is, okay, full disclosure, this is my daughter. This was one of those pages, and I had to scribe it at the bottom because she is not yet able to write other than happy. She asked me to spell happy for her. Learning languages makes me feel, draw a picture happy, what I want to explain about my picture. And she chose to say, I like drawing hearts, I like to learn languages. This to me was just a very, very first step in thinking about herself as a learner of languages. Because we actually live in a monolingual home. English is the language of our home. She's going into French immersion. So I'll be interested to see what this kind of sheet is like now as compared to after she's been in French immersion for a while. And I thought if I could implement it with a 4-year-old, I could, you know, implement it, help with implementation at a lot of different ages. And it was, I also wanted to see how easy or hard it was, even though it's just one child. And it was surprisingly easy. She had no trouble with the concept of a languages portfolio. We started languages portfolio. She had no trouble with the concept at all. It seemed very easy for her to grasp. I was surprised. Here is a biography page we adapted, and you can see we have the adaptation. Just a housekeeping note for those of you who do go forward and adapt. Take it from me. Make sure you record this information while you're adapting materials. Because once you start building up a body of work, it becomes very easy to lose track of where it comes from. And so you want that sort of copyright reference material at the bottom of every single page. Because those pages will get taken out of a main booklet and used and scattered and distributed, and you want that copyright info referencing at the bottom of all of them. I know because we did it, and the inputting that was supposed to be done on the bottom wasn't done, and we were sitting, because we went to Spain. We were sitting on this train in Spain with these documents and going through every single page of all these documents and finding where we had referenced it from and writing it on the bottom again. So take it from me, do it at the beginning of your work. So this was from a junior high school, and I believe French is a second language. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, and you'll notice that the biography materials this time are in English. And I know you have some words to say about use of language. The reason they're in English, plain and simple, is just money. It's just the fact that with the resources that we have, what we've been able to do is adapt the stuff that's available, and the stuff we've worked with so far is in English. And it's a common copy that all of the teachers in all of our programs, because we have so many languages, for us to translate every single sheet into every single language, we're going to have to figure out how that's going to happen. But that will require money. So at this time, they're in English. It's not necessarily a decision, a philosophical decision. It's more of a convenience and economy decision. So this was, I believe it's a French as a second language junior high school student. And they're doing some of this kind of intercultural reflection that we saw in the milestone. What I've noticed about English is that there are no separations between masculin and féminin. Also, I speak English at school. What I've noticed about French is that an accent can change the way a word sounds. What I've noticed about Bulgarian is that I speak it at home with my family, and it's very close to Russian. What I've noticed about Arabic is that Arabic is written from right to left. Something I would like to learn more about is how to write and read in Arabic. Something interesting, an interesting byproduct of using this so far is that the teachers have told us that they're learning new things about their kids. Like just from that teaching perspective and knowing your kids, they're saying things like, I had no idea this student knew how to speak Yiddish, because in the same group of these exemplars, there were several students who Yiddish was spoken in the home. I said, I had no idea the kid spoke Yiddish. I had no idea that child spoke Bulgarian at home. And beginning to realize the language resources that are available to them in the classroom and gaining a better understanding of who their students are through something that was actually fairly quick and simple. This is an example from very early in an FSL program. I believe it's just in the first year. And thinking about aligning with assessment practices and beliefs. Now, I know this teacher, and she's somebody that I've worked with for many years, and she's attended a lot of assessment for learning workshops and really tried to work in this area, and she loves self-reflection, and she's really trying to develop with her students in that area. And you can see, and I know that she didn't direct them to do this because in this package of exemplars they were all kind of different, but this student took it upon themselves to create a little legend at the top: I know, sort of, and never. Right there. And so the ones that he or she really knows how to do are in red, and the ones they feel they sort of know how to do are in blue, and the ones that apparently they've never done are in gold, and then this one, part of it is in red and part of it is in gold. And then these ones are blank, which I'm not sure what that indicates. Maybe they just ran out of time. But this to me speaks to that concern that people sometimes have about students not being truthful about their reflection. To me, this is quite an honest self-reflection from the student regarding what they're able to do and what they know. There were all kinds of interesting things in this group of exemplars. There were some students who wrote, only with my teacher's help, or they felt they needed to write when the words are posted in the classroom, or I can say what I like and don't like, but only about things in my classroom. So clearly that was some kind of vocabulary they had worked with. And my favorite was a student had written, I can react to what someone says to me, and then they had written in little letters, at grade level. I think they're on to us. I think they know what we're trying to do as teachers. So this speaks to me about some, obviously in this classroom, she's doing some pretty good work with self-reflection, this teacher, because there's some very honest self-reflection happening. When we do our information sessions with teachers, a lot of our teachers have had quite a bit of professional development in the area of assessment for learning and assessment in general, classroom assessment in general. And so we make a brief reference to some of the experts or some of the planning models that they will have been working with in their schools, because it's not consistent. Teachers would be working with different consultants, or their principal is expected to be an instructional leader, or sometimes the principal brings in somebody from outside the district, so it can look a whole bunch of different ways. But just a passing glance or passing acknowledgement to these things, that using the ELP aligns with, for instance, Ann Davies' triangulation of evidence. A lot of our teachers work with Ann Davies. And I don't know if you're familiar with Ann Davies' triangulation of evidence, but the 3 types of evidence, she talks about how you need 3 types of evidence in the classroom to be able to talk about what students know and can do. And those 3 types of evidence are conversations, observations, and products. And so the correlation that we draw for teachers is, okay, the products part, or what the students actually produce at the end of their learning, is kind of like what you'll find in the dossier. But the conversations, which is the part where students are telling you about their learning, that's the biography. That's where they're thinking about their learning. That's where it's almost like opening a window to their mind. So I really like the checklists. The checklists are good, but to me, it's those kinds of worksheets that we were seeing before with the I speak Bulgarian at home, and this is what I notice about cultural differences. That's kind of like this window into the student's mind, and that's where we see the conversations coming in. Black and Willem's 4 types of action. Questioning, feedback, sharing criteria, self-assessment. If you are breaking down can-do statements into multiple criteria and using those to frame instruction, you are sharing criteria with students. Of course, self-assessment, it's pretty self-explanatory. Like right as the most obvious links with these. Understanding by design, a lot of people really like to use UBD. It's on the surface not always the perfect fit for second languages, but a lot of people do like to use UBD. And so identifying those desired results, maybe you're identifying them from the can-do statements, for example. Determining what would be the acceptable evidence. What does it mean? I can read everyday texts I see around me, if that was one. What exactly does that mean? And we saw an example of a teacher in Spain framing her instruction around the can-do statements, and I don't think she knew she was doing UBD, but I think she was, because she took a can-do statement from the CEFR, put it up in the room as this is what we're working towards, and what she did was it was an English bilingual program, so the students only spoke Spanish and they were learning English. And she took various pictures of signs in English from the internet and gave them to the students, and they had to decipher what they thought these signs meant and why they thought that. And she had the can-do statements broken down into smaller criteria, and she just had them on construction paper in the class, and when the students felt that they could do that, when they had enough evidence to be able to say, I can do this, they went and signed their name on the can-do statement, which is great. It's great assessment for learning. It's a great way to frame instruction. And so she was doing that. She was identifying the desired result, determining the acceptable evidence, planned the learning experience and the instruction. For reflecting the curricular expectations, and I know this will be very different for all of you in your different contexts, when we give these information sessions to Alberta teachers, of course, we've got the full gamut. We're dealing with a whole bunch of different frameworks at the same time, and some of them don't have a whole lot in common. So we try and show them just the most obvious curricular links. We just go into the very, very most obvious ones in the information session. And so one of them would be, say for instance, in the French as a second language, recognize that learning another language and developing knowledge about other cultures is a lifelong learning process. Just by virtue of using the European language portfolio, you're addressing that outcome. International language and culture framework, select and use a variety of metacognitive strategies to enhance language learning. The bilingual programs, grade 10, examine attitudes and values that contribute to cross-cultural understanding. When we go out to schools, and if we do a specific information sessions, which is really only to high schools, because in most elementary schools there might be one or two French teachers, for example, then we would customize this to reflect only outcomes within the programs of studies that they are teaching. The other nice thing about this that causes some buy-in for teachers is we say, like, take a look at these outcomes. And you think about addressing these outcomes, and it's different than, say, hitting an outcome. Hitting an outcome is sort of this same construct of, I taught it. I don't know if you remember, there's this little cartoon of a child standing next to a dog, and his friend comes along, and he says, I taught Spot to whistle. And they both look at the dog, and nothing happens. And he says, well, I said I taught him. I didn't say he learned it. So hitting an outcome is kind of like, well, I taught it, I taught it, I taught it, I taught it, I taught it. Whereas really deeply assessing an outcome is, I know the student can do this because I have this evidence. And so being able to gather that kind of evidence in a meaningful way, we ask the teachers to look at these outcomes, say, aren't these kind of sometimes the toughest outcomes to get at in your program of studies? They're not the most obvious ones. They're not the ones that are necessarily the most obvious to you in how you actually deliver these outcomes in the classroom. And they seem to, there's noddings of heads, and yes, I see that now. So I think that it does help with that. And next steps, create can-do statements for A1, A2. It's not exactly clear to me, but it's becoming clearer how we will have can-do statements that correlate with the levels of the CEFR and correlate with curricula, because we need to be able to somehow do both. And draw explicit links with curricula, and bring pilot teachers together to elicit feedback in current biography. This is the next few months. What I mean next steps. Maybe it's time to, with your colleagues that you're going to be working with, maybe these are colleagues with whom you will be closely working while implementing ELP, or maybe these will be just colleagues that you will call for ideas, or people you'll be associated with in some way. Those might be the best people to have the discussion with, but you can discuss it with anyone. How is the biography most useful? Now this is for your context. Okay, so not Edmonton Public Schools context, but your context. How will it promote good pedagogy? How will it improve assessment practices? How will it fulfill curricular expectations? Or any if these don't work for you, what will? So what is it about the biography? What are going to be its characteristics? You can talk about its characteristics, you can talk about its content, or you could talk about its format. But how is it going to work best for you in your context? Thinking about the biography, so this is the real workbook part of the portfolio. What were some of the things that, or some of the points that maybe crystallized out of your discussion of biography? Things that you find that are important to remember about biography? Observations? I think for us, what we're learning is it's all about how it's used. I mean, how it's formatted is a consideration. And of course, what the purpose of each biography sheet is important as well. But implementation is key. It's how the teacher actually works with this in the classroom that's important. You can have the most fabulous checklists in the world, you know, beautifully written, beautifully formatted. But if it's not implemented properly in the classroom, you may as well not bother. Because it has to be implemented with the purpose of serving the purpose of learning languages. It has to be implemented into instruction. Because I have seen teachers give kids a checklist, because we work with lots of can-do statements, say, yeah, fill that out, because that consultant told me I'm supposed to do this in the classroom. Well, it may as well not have bothered. There's no point to that. The kid just goes down and goes on. You know, there's no mindfulness to that at all, and it doesn't make it assessment. In order to be assessment, it has to be serving learning in some way. It has to be integrated into instruction in such a way that the student gets just as much information or more information out of that as you do. It has to be something that feeds back into learning. And so I think the actual process of using anything that is supplied in a biography is just as important of making the stuff itself. The stuff is one thing, the process is entirely another. So that's why we're thinking about things such as teacher guides, and we're thinking about things such as I've got a menu of teacher in-services made up in my mind of that we need to be working with teachers, and how do we coach teachers in using this. And truthfully, those teachers who are used to applying assessment for learning strategies in their classroom already are going to have an easier time of it because it will be familiar to them. And they tend to understand the underpinning philosophy behind it. But for teachers who are new to metacognition, or practitioners who are new to this idea of self-reflection in the classroom, it may not mean much. So I think it's a coached process as well, the biography. It's a document, but it's also a coached process. Bringing the dossier alive in EPS. Well, there isn't much to tell here because we haven't gotten to the point where we've collected enough for dossiers. But I can tell you what we talk about with teachers at this point. We talk about how a dossier is representations of cultural and language experiences, how it could be digital, how it could be a box full of artifacts. And when we present this idea, it seems that the elementary school teachers say, yes, okay, that's right, we use that already. Can include oral and written samples. All items in the dossier are chosen by the learner. From some of the examples we saw in Spain, it was clearly a guided process with the dossier, and you could tell that some of this, you know, there was sort of one consistent item in the dossier where maybe the teacher had said, okay, this is a good item for your dossier now that we've done this in class. And it's probably going to be a combination of things that are guided by the teacher to include in the dossier, and things that the students independently choose to put in themselves. Interestingly enough, when we do the information sessions with teachers, I don't know if it's the same in this part of Canada, but a lot of teachers tend to have some reservations about the word portfolio, and that's something that we address right off the bat. Right when teachers come into the session, we ask them to write down, just on a piece of paper, what do you think a portfolio is? What do you know about portfolios in Alberta? What's your experience with them? how do you feel about them? It can just be a couple of words, and some teachers write and write and write and write, and some just write something very short. And we say, okay, put that aside, we will come back to that. Then we go through the components of the portfolio, and when we get to the dossier, we ask them to pull out that piece of paper where they've written down what they think a portfolio is. And we say, okay, now on your piece of paper, if you have something written like it's a collection of work, it's exemplars of students' work, it represents progress, it represents best work, and people start to nod their heads, and then we say that's kind of what the dossier is. That's kind of like what the dossier is. So you're able to acknowledge those reservations around the word portfolio, and yet educate teachers at the same time how this is different than perhaps their concept of portfolios were. And they're not all negative. You know, they're not all negative concepts of portfolios. Some people have had wonderful experiences with portfolios. But that's how we tie in that with dossier. We tie it in at the dossier part. So we acknowledge it right off the bat and say, put it aside, we'll come to that. And then when we come to the dossier, we bring that out and revisit them. If that's helpful information, I don't know. Suggested items. When we talk about the dossier with teachers, we think, you know, here are some items that you might want to think about helping your students include in dossiers. Could be their international credentials. As you know, many of our students do international testing, so they will receive like a B1 level certificate from the DELF and DELF, or they'll receive a certificate for HSK or YCT for young learners in Chinese. And they can include the actual certificate or a copy of the certificate. Cultural artifacts. And again, the format of the dossier will have some impact on this. Project work done in class, samples of work, emails, videos. Do you have a letter from your grandma that's written in another language? Maybe not the language of study in class, but another language. You could include that, for example. Items to reflect language use outside of school, to make the dossier representative of the student as a whole, rather than necessarily representative of just what's happening in the classroom. So discussion point for you. Again, I'm going to put the floor back to you. What's the best format for a dossier in your context? Lots of things to consider here. What items would you encourage individuals to include in a dossier? Simple questions, maybe not a simple answer.
In some European implementations, it's been found useful to distinguish between a process dossier and a display dossier. In the 2003 collection of case studies that I edited, which are on the Council of Europe ELP website, the Finnish teacher who contributed describes in some detail how his learners coming to the end of their school spent a whole day in self and peer assessment of dossier materials before they each came to the collection of samples of work that they felt best represented the range of what they could do in English. And that was what they took from school on into the next stage of their education. On the other hand, in IILT, with the milestone portfolio, we have always put some kind of structure on the dossier and used it as a sort of ongoing record-keeping tool that's quite specific to the course of learning that learners are following, and in that way is a bit continuous with the biography, which is a more general reflective tool that's nevertheless feeding back into the learning process.
Is the dossier, does it best serve the purpose if it is a series of exemplars of best work, or does it best serve the purpose if it represents a range of progression over time? So showing exemplars in terms of improvement and proficiency, or various disparate examples of best work?
I think that very much depends on what you want the dossier to show. I can imagine that in some contexts, with some individual learners, they would be very keen that what the dossier showed was the best that they could do at this point. But I can also imagine that other learners, especially in our context back in Ireland, Second Start learners, might be very keen to be able to show work that they had produced over a year or 2 years of a course, precisely to demonstrate that progress. I think those are both possible uses of the dossier for display purposes. I don't think one is better than the other. So one of the earliest things we have to do, especially with beginning learners, is make sure that they know how to make a telephone call, to explain to the receptionist who will answer the call that they're not coming. The reason for that is perfectly simple. We want them to be responsible for their learning, but also responsible more generally. Secondly, the Irish taxpayer is paying £3 million a year, or €3 million a year, for the provision of these courses. They're provided absolutely free of charge. They need to be respected. We wanted to fit that in somewhere. We put it into the dossier.
So the other point I want to make is that it's one European language portfolio, and these three parts of it are linked. So when I speak of the dossier, I shouldn't think about it as just the dossier, but the dossier in relation to my biography, in relationship to the passport. So for me, the dossier should demonstrate what I'm saying in the biography. In other words, this is what I can do, this is what I, indicating I can do. Therefore, the dossier should demonstrate that aspect. And therefore, as I progress in terms of what I can do, that's how I, control my dossier. In other words, what no longer is an evidence of what I can do, but I've moved beyond that. That's how I should. I see that the language portfolio as a one piece, and all three parts of it, are linked to one another, and therefore I shouldn't see the dossier as just a collection of. It's in relation to my biography. It's in relationship to where I am on the passport.
So,
when we do our information sessions at Edmonton Public Schools, the way that we try to help teachers understand it is that all three components should be singing the same tune.
Right.
That if you are indicating something in your passport, if you've completed a passport at this time, that you've indicated that you have a writing capacity at a certain level, that there should be writing samples at some point, either in that target language in the biography sheets or a sample of writing in the dossier, that the whole thing is evidence. You might have some things in the dossier, for example, that are examples of intercultural experiences. When we were in Spain, the first time we went out to a tapas bar, and a teacher gave me a coaster and said, "Here, put this in your dossier." And it's not necessarily directly related to language proficiency, but it would be related to the intercultural piece that I might be discussing in the